Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to the Old Stone Church YouTube channel.
I want to take you back for a moment to 2016. In fact, 3 years ago to this month, January 2016. And I want you to remember not just what we were doing at that time, but I want you to remember, think about how we were feeling at that time. And by we, I mean the good people of the Old Stone Church, whose mission it is to love Christ and serve City. And by we, I mean the people of Cleveland and Northeast Ohio, January 2016. Do you remember where we were, what we were feeling at that time? Just in case you've forgotten, we were filled with just a little bit of worry. We were fretting just a little bit. We had some anxiety stirring within us. Why? I'm glad you asked. Because we were preparing to welcome the 2016 Republican National Convention that summer. We were doing all the good work, the hard work of preparing to make Cleveland a host city for the Republican Convention that was going to meet here on our doorsteps, here in the heart of downtown Cleveland. But there was a lot of worry. Do you remember there was some anxiety, some trouble? I heard people saying, I don't know why we're having the RNC here anyway. It's going to be nothing but trouble. Do you remember at the time, President Trump? Then at that time, it was candidate Trump and his campaign. It was drawing huge crowds wherever he went. Often those crowds were filled with great energy. And sometimes it was reported to us that they were filled with conflict and sometimes outbreaks of disruption and violence. And people said, do we really want that here in Cleveland, Ohio? And we were being promised by the media that protesters were coming. The word Antifa became a regular part of our vocabulary. We were promised that protesters from the right, protesters from the left were coming to Cleveland, Ohio with the sole intention of raining down chaos on our city. I spoke with a number of our business leaders, our community leaders, our retail owners, and even church leaders who for a brief moment felt that maybe what we need to do is plan to board up the place. There were people who said, we need to put boards over our stained glass windows, lock the doors, and head for the hills, so to speak, even though we were being told over and over again by the people who knew how to bring a convention to a city that the safest places, the places that can avoid damage or violence, are those places where people are. By filling your church, by filling your business with the presence of human beings. I remember in that time, Beth and I were off to weekly planning meetings with other city leaders, security meetings. We were being prepared on how to manage things and handle things when the convention finally made it to our city in July. Our local police were given special equipment and specialized training. Outside forces were being contracted to come into Cleveland and help keep our city safe. There was lots of anxiety. Lots of worry, lots of preparing to bring and welcome the world to our front steps. And very few of you are aware that the day that the RNC began, Beth and I had the FBI in our living room of our condominium overlooking Public Square. Oh, we didn't share that much. Beth had received an interesting phone call or two in the weeks leading up to the convention. Of course, she was not going to disclose names. We're a church. You ought to expect confidentiality from a church. But then again, if you've got trouble brewing, you need it to bring in the experts. Oh, there was personal anxiety for us too, because we wanted to work with all of you at keeping our doors open here at the Old Stone Church. And I thank so many of you who are here today who volunteered. Do you remember it was from 10 in the morning to 8 o'clock at night we kept our doors open so people from around this nation could come into the Old Stone Church for rest and water and to sit in the Lincoln pew. And we gave a special place for our officers and our police so that they could cool off in the heat of the day and they could come into this cool, safe sanctuary. Now, I remember there was a fair bit of worry and anxiety and preparedness happening about that time. Well, let me ask you, do you remember what happened during the Republican convention? Do you remember the crisis that happened? You don't, do you? There wasn't a crisis. There wasn't a conflict, and thanks to a lot of that preparedness, for sure. Nothing very eventful happened in Cleveland at all. Oh, the media might have been disappointed. I'm sure they were looking for some sort of chaos to report on. But we here in Cleveland, we were rejoicing. We were celebrating. We were having a great old time that whole week. Some of us who live downtown, I know we barely slept all week. We wanted to be in the thick of it and enjoy the energy and enjoy the party, so to speak. But let me tell you, nothing made me prouder to be a Clevelander than when I saw the headline in the Washington Post right at the end of the RNC. Do you remember? It said, "We were promised a riot. In Cleveland, we got a block party instead." I thought to myself, yeah, that's the way we roll in Cleveland, Ohio. We prepared for the worst. We were filled with stress and anxiety. We were promised a riot, said the headlines, but in Cleveland, we got a block party instead. Our poor little city on the lake, that week went from mistake by the lake to championship host city. That week, the great city of Ohio, Cleveland, Ohio, went from ordinary to extraordinary. Well, listen, I want you to take a look back a little further in time. In fact, I want you to take a peek back 2,000 years in time. And I want you to take a look at that poor little town of Cana, a real pauper village, mistake on a hill, Cana. I want you to take a peek back to Cana and that historic wedding that took place 2,000 years ago. And guess what? You get the same sort of scenario that we got here in Cleveland in 2016. Oh, you know there was worry. There was a wedding going to take place in a small village town, a poor town. Those parents, those grandparents, they had been saving, they had been planning, they had been working for this wedding probably since the day their children came into this world. There were great social expectations on this family that they would not just host a wedding, but they would host a wedding for the whole village, whether you lived there or not. Whether you were a long-time resident or whether you were a visitor like Jesus and his mother and his disciples that happened to be in Cana at the time. There was a great deal of anxiety about making sure you repay hospitality with hospitality, celebration with celebration. You wanted to make sure not only your family and your friends were included, but your neighbors and their neighbors, and the whole town could come out and party with you. You know, when Beth and I got married, there was a little bit of stress in our planning. You see, Beth and I wanted to have a small wedding. We wanted to have our reception at a Vietnamese restaurant. Our family and our church had sponsored a Vietnamese refugee family, and that family had grown this wonderful Vietnamese restaurant in our city. But her family didn't quite agree with that plan. In fact, her father, Beth's dad, was a very high-profile sales executive for one of the largest radio stations in our hometown. And he said, "How can we invite all my clients? All my business relationships to your wedding if we have it in this small place that will only seat 50 or 60 people. And we said, well, we don't care about inviting your clients. And he said, I do. We compromised and didn't have it at the Vietnamese restaurant. And we didn't have just 50 or 60 people. We had a whole lot more. And to be honest with you, I was very glad that we had the wedding and the wedding reception that we did. I imagine for that couple there in Cana, there was an expectation that everybody would be included. Such is the way of hospitality. But it wasn't just stress that was happening leading up to that wedding. There was a crisis. There was a crisis in Cana. Do you remember what happened? The wine ran out. Listen, this is not just, hey, we can run down to the grocery store and get some more wine. This is not, hey, we can hop in the car and drive to the liquor store and get more wine. This is the poor town of Cana, and the wine ran out. And there is an expectation in that community that the wine will hold until people cannot consume another drop. I don't know how many of you have ever been to an Italian wedding. Can you imagine being at an Italian wedding and the wine runs out? Indeed. The shame, the horror. Thank you, Brother Joseph. Such as it was in Cana, it would be very similar to an Italian community where wine is very much part of the event. It's part of the social grace and the way that hospitality is extended. The wine ran out. And that's not just a problem. That was a crisis. The embarrassment that that family would have felt that they could not be hospitable to their guests because they had no wine. An incredible social faux pas would be upon them. No doubt people would tell that story for years and years to come. I know that at Beth's and my wedding, we had an open bar. And one of our friends, a young man, drank so much alcohol from that open bar that people had to put him in a wheelchair and roll him out of the hall, put him in a cab with $20 in his pocket and a real request from the cab driver that when he got him home, could you please get him into the house and just keep the $20? That story has been told over and over and over again at every one of our family gatherings or reunions. Anytime we slip into conversations about weddings. Oh yeah, and there was the time at Mark and Beth's wedding when we had to put Martin in the wheelchair and stick him in a cab with $20 home to send him home. Those stories have a way of sticking with people. I want you to magnify that humorous story 100-fold. What a crisis for the wine to run out. But look, guess who was at the party? Guess who was there at the wedding? Jesus. Jesus was there at the wedding at Cana. And let me tell you, in case you've forgotten, when Jesus is in your life, when Jesus is at the party, your worry is transformed into confidence and assuredness. When Jesus is at the party, whatever is troubling you, your fear, your anxiety can be transformed to hope. When Jesus is at the party, water gets changed into wine. When Jesus is at the party, ordinary becomes extraordinary. Now, I have to tell you, this is kind of a preacher thing, and maybe you're not as excited about this as I am, but when I read that story, the wedding at Cana passage, and I get to that section where it says that there were 6 stone vats, I'm like, yes, it's the stone vats. They're for the water of purification. They're for the law, so that people can practice the law. They can wash their hands in ritual purification and thereby be in relationship with God. They can be purified and made right with God through this law that they needed to practice. And I'm thinking, Jesus took the law and he transformed it into the wine of God's grace. I'm thinking the first miracle, the first sign that Jesus worked when he entered his public ministry was to show people that the relationship that God wants with us may not be a strings attached, conditional relationship based on a law that we need to practice, but rather on our ability to receive this unconditional flowing grace of God, like wine filling vats overflowing with wine. It was those 6 jars filled with the new wine, 6 of them, 20 to 30 gallon vessels overflowing with the grace of God. My cup overflows, says Psalm 23. No strings attached. Jesus is here. Jesus is at the party. And when Jesus is in your life, grace abounds. Now come on, think of it this way. Jesus didn't just change water into wine. He didn't just trade ordinary water into ordinary wine. John's gospel says that Jesus transformed that water, the purification water, into the best wine. He didn't just trade one law, one old law for one new law. Jesus didn't just change the bad stuff that the host usually serves after the guests are already drunk and can't tell the difference between good wine and bad wine. No, Jesus gave them the good wine. And I like to say, it's proof positive right there in the gospel, Jesus served Italian wine. It said he served the good wine, and everybody knows the good wine comes from Tuscany. Maybe it's a Barolo, I don't know. But I do know it was the good wine. Jesus could have given them ordinary wine, but he gave them extraordinary instead. Even the chief steward was dumbfounded when he drank that new wine, when he tasted this good wine that Jesus had transformed from water. You can just see the headline in Cana the next day, can't you? In Cana, wine runs out at wedding. But with Jesus, they got a block party instead. What began as an ordinary wedding in a small, impoverished hillside town, mistake on the hill in ancient Israel, became an extraordinary day. The day love came to town. It became a day that we've been talking about ever since for 2,000 years. Well, guess what? I believe that's the kind of church that Jesus came to create in all of us. A church where grace abounds, where our ordinary selves become extraordinary beings in Jesus Christ. I believe that's the kind of church that Jesus has been working within us ever since. I believe that's the kind of church God asks us to be even today. Ordinary folks become extraordinary people in Jesus Christ. I believe that Jesus still to this day asks us to move beyond a strings-attached form of relationship with God, a condition of receiving God's love and mercy. Listen, we don't receive God's grace because of something we do. We receive God's grace because something Jesus already did a long, long time ago. Anyone ever asked you, hey, when were you saved? I remember down south, people used to ask me that all the time. Hey, Pastor, when were you saved? And they're looking for an answer like, I don't know, I was saved at Christian night at the baseball game. Or I was saved when I was so far down, I had nowhere else to go, and Jesus lifted me up. Well, that may be true. But the only answer to that question, when were you saved, is this. I was saved 2,000 years ago when Jesus Christ gave his life for me. It had nothing to do with me, and it had everything to do with him. Jesus even said it himself. He said, "You didn't choose me, I chose you." When were you saved? When was your water transformed into wine 2,000 years ago? When Jesus entered his public ministry, when Jesus went to that poor town of Cana, when Jesus moved through his life and his ministry and ended up at the cross. When were we saved? 2,000 years ago. I believe that Jesus has been trying to create that relationship with God in each and every one of us. We don't have to live our lives as a condition to receiving God's grace, only as a response. We only have to live our lives as a humble and faithful response to God's grace. I don't know if any of you remember Tony Campolo's story about a woman named Agnes. Tony Campolo, if you don't know, is a sociologist from the East Coast. He's a writer, and he's a very evangelical Christian. A number of years ago, Tony Campolo was speaking in Honolulu, and because he was put off time because of the time change, the time zone, he woke up at 3 a.m, ready for breakfast. He was famished. And so he went out into the downtown streets of Honolulu looking for a place to get something to eat, and he found a place called Hank's Place. It was a greasy spoon, but good place to get some hearty chow at 3 a.m. And Tony Campolo came up to one of the stools at the counter in Hank's Place, and Hank came out kind of greasy aproned and big-bellied, and what can I get you, he says. And Tony Campolo ordered his breakfast and visited with Hank for a bit. And at 3 a.m., 3 prostitutes came into Hank's Place as well, and they sat down on the stools next to Tony Campolo. Tony says, "Don't ask how I know. You could tell just by looking at them that they were prostitutes." And he said as he sat there eating his breakfast, he heard these 3 prostitutes talking about each other, keeping each other safe, checking in on each other, making sure all was going well that night. And at one point, one of the prostitutes says to the other 2, "Hey, guess what tomorrow is?" And they said, "We don't know. What's tomorrow?" She said, "It's my birthday." And the other 2 kind of break out in laughter. They say, "Oh, well, happy birthday, Agnes. What do you want, a cake, a party? Ha, ha, ha." And Agnes sort of joined the laughter a little bit, but Tony Campolo said you could hear a hint of pain behind her laughter. And she said, "No, I don't want a cake or a party. I've never had a birthday party in my life." Well, after they finished their coffees and went out, Tony Campolo says to Hank, "Hey, Hank, do you know those 3 women?" And Hank says, "Agnes and her friends? Sure, they come in here every night, 3 a.m. like clockwork." And Tony Campolo says to Hank, "I've got an idea. Why don't we throw Agnes a birthday party here at your place tomorrow night?" Hank's trying to figure out what Tony's talking about, and he says, "Really, Hank, do you know her and some of her friends?" Hank says, "I know them all." And he says, "Well, can you get the word out that we're going to throw a surprise party for Agnes tomorrow night?" Hank gets it now. He says, "I love it. It's a great idea. I'll tell you what," he said, "I'll get my wife to help me. We're going to bake a big cake for Agnes." Well, the next night, 3 a.m., the place is packed. Wall-to-wall prostitutes. And Tony and Hank. And Hank's wife. Behind the counters, a big streamer says, "Happy birthday." There's balloons all around the room. There's a big slab cake on the counter, and it says, "Happy birthday, Agnes." They're ready. They're ready to shout surprise. And sure enough, 3 a.m., like clockwork, Agnes and her 2 friends walk in from the street, and they are greeted with a shout of surprise. Happy birthday, Agnes! Everybody's shouting, and they start singing, happy birthday to you, happy birthday to you. And Agnes is dumbfounded. She staggers back and sits down in one of the vinyl seats at a booth near the door. She can't even make it over to the counter. She's trying to process what's going on here. Hank's walking the cake over to the booth, candles streaming. Happy birthday, dear Agnes. Happy birthday to you. And he plunks the cake down and he says, come on, Agnes, blow those candles out, cut the cake. And the room goes very quiet because they notice that Agnes is crying. And Agnes says, this is the nicest thing anybody has ever done for me in my life. And she blows the candles out, and then she looks around the room at her friends and this strange man, Tony Campolo, standing nearby. And she says, hey, everybody, would you mind if I just took this cake upstairs and showed my mother? I'll bring it back, I promise. But my mom hasn't been well in years, and I think this would make her so happy, just if I could show her the cake. And they're like, sure, Agnes, of course. You go show Mom the cake, and we'll wait here. And Agnes goes out of the door, and they can see her walking by the glass-paned window in front of Hank's place, holding this cake, getting ready to go up the stairs, apparently where she lived with her mother. And the room is absolutely still. And Tony Campolo looks around and says, say, would anyone mind if we prayed for Agnes right now? And people went, prayer, what? Prayer, what? Sure, yeah, you go ahead and pray if it makes you feel better, mister. And so Tony Campolo prayed there, right in that room filled with these prostitutes from Honolulu. He prayed that Agnes might know the fullness of God's transforming love, not just that night, but every night. He prayed that Agnes might get a fresh start in her life, that she might come to know this one Jesus who's dwelling in her heart and dwelling in the world right then and there. And when Tony finished praying, he says, amen, and he looks up, and he looks over by the counter, and there's Hank. And Hank's got a big old scowl on his face. Hank is not happy about this prayer business going on in his restaurant. And so he growls at Tony. He says, you didn't tell me you were some sort of religious fanatic. What church are you from? And Tony said it was one of those moments when the Holy Spirit gives you the exact right words to say. Tony looked at Hank and he said, I go to one of those churches that throws birthday parties for prostitutes at 3 a.m. Now, the Holy Spirit obviously gave Hank the right words too, because Hank spoke right back to Tony and he said, no, you don't. If there was a church like that, I'd go. Well, guess what, folks? That's the church that Jesus Christ came to create in all of us. A church where ordinary lives become extraordinary in Jesus Christ. A church where a greasy spoon can become the very first birthday party for a prostitute in Honolulu. A church where ordinary water gets turned into extraordinary wine. Look, I don't know what kind of pressures you're experiencing in your life right now. I don't know what's pressing down on you, what's weighing heavily on your hearts, what kind of worries or stressors are there for you in your life right now. But I do know this. I know that when you invite Jesus into your heart, and when you invite Jesus into your church, when you invite Jesus into this world and into your lives, hearts start to overflow with the wine of God's grace. I do know that when you start to invite Christ into your life, not just 1 hour on a Sunday morning, but each and every moment, those moments can be changed from ordinary to extraordinary moments. Fears can be transformed to hope. Worry and anxiety can be transformed to expectations filled with joy because you know God is going to do a new thing in your life. Listen, can you see the headlines? Can you see the headlines now? Church prepares for worst. Church prepares for worst. But in Jesus Christ, God throws a block party instead. Praise be to God. And the people of God say, Amen.
Thanks for watching our video. Make sure to subscribe to get the latest and greatest videos from the Old Stone Church. And if you feel blessed by our message, please go to theoldstonechurch.org and click Donate. God bless you today and forever. The Old Stone Church. We've been loving Christ and serving City since 1820.